ahead and get started. Thank you for coming to a very packed session of Empathy as Infrastructure, Reimagining Waterfront Design for the Next Century. I'm going to turn it over to Mike Taylor from South Brooklyn Marine Terminal.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Mike Taylor. I'm the commercial manager for Equinor's South Brooklyn Marine Terminal. Our session today is titled Empathy as Infrastructure, Reimagining Waterfront Design for the Next Century. It's a phrase that invites us to rethink what we mean when we talk about infrastructure, not just as seawalls, bulkheads, elevation strategies, but something deeper, a system of relationships, trust, and understanding between people and the place. As New York City continues to confront climate uncertainty, the technical challenges are immense. At our South Brooklyn Marine Terminal, climate resilience and flood resistance was a core part of our technical design. But just as critical is a different and often under-recognized challenge, how well we understand the experiences, values, and priorities of the communities that call our waterfronts home. Because resilience isn't only about how high we build or how strong we engineer, it's about whether these solutions truly serve the people that they're meant to protect. When projects fail to reflect local realities, we see it in delays, in opposition, and costly redesigns. But when the design is rooted in listening and understanding, deep, grounded, neighborhood-scale engagement, we unlock something powerful. Infrastructure that's not only more adaptive, but also widely trusted and supported. At the South Brooklyn Marine Terminal, we have integrated with the community on multiple fronts. Through our development of Windscape, which overlooks the port, we are connecting offshore wind to the public through exhibits, events, and school groups. Waterfront access that the community enjoyed prior to the redevelopment has been retained in the form of public tours, which will commence following the completion of our construction. Looking beyond our Empire Wind project, we'll find new uses that maintain the community connection and integration until the next offshore wind project. Today's panel brings together perspectives on how emotionally intelligent, community-centered design can reduce risk, strengthen long-term performance, and shape waterfronts that people feel connected to, not displaced from. We'll explore how empathy can function as a form of infrastructure in its own right, guiding investment, informing trade-offs, and ultimately producing more durable outcomes across the city's shoreline communities. As you listen, I invite you to consider, what would it mean to treat empathy not as a step in the process, but as a core waterfront design tool? Thank you, and enjoy the panel.
All right, thank you, Mike, for that opening, and I want to also thank South Brooklyn Marine Terminal and Equinor for their long-term partnership with the Waterfront Alliance, and I think fitting to this panel, their long-term commitment to serving the communities around South Brooklyn really well. I think we're going to spend the time on this panel talking about a lot of parks and public sector projects. They are one of the few companies on the private sector side and one of the few even more industrial companies that really gets design right and gets the community relationship right. So we're going to focus in this panel on designing future waterfronts and what that means for understanding what residents value and need as water levels rise. So we're going to explore how community-rooted and emotionally intelligent design is going to lead to more durable and adaptable projects, and how better listening can dramatically reduce risk and contingency. We're going to talk about the work that some of these folks have done in their own communities and as consultants on projects, including right outside the window here. And at this point, I'll introduce the panelists. So Gonzalo Cruz leads AECOM's landscape and design practice, overseeing projects and collaborations both in New York as well as around the country. And I'm excited that he just 5 minutes ago shared that he is an ASLA fellow for the. Oh, I didn't know that wasn't. He did. He got an award that's very cool that I won't share, but it's very impressive and very cool. He's worked on notable projects including South Battery Park City Resilience in Wagner Park, Brooklyn Bridge Montgomery Coastal Resilience, Open Space, the Dumbo Archway Plaza, and Harborside Waterfront Park in Hoboken. Next we have Kimberlae Saul, who is a licensed architect and urban designer in New York, who's now the Vice President and Resilience Principal at Jacobs. She brings a multidisciplinary background working on climate adaptation infrastructure in the public realm, and was most recently here at the Battery Park City Authority, advancing design for capital projects, working on the planning side of Wagner Park and the full set of Battery Park City resilience projects. We have Mychal Johnson, community-based advocate for environmental, economic, and social justice in the South Bronx. He's the co-founder of South Bronx Unite and founding member of the Mott Haven Port Morris Community Land Stewards, where he's also a board member. Our team works very closely with him on waterfront access issues in that neighborhood. And then finally, we have Justine Shapiro-Kline, who leads ONE's planning practice and brings over a decade of experience as an architect and urban planner, working alongside public agencies, communities, and organizations across the country, working at different scales and typologies, from kind of the master planning level and visioning side to design and construction that's very on the ground, the streetscapes, the plazas. So with that, I would love to kind of start the conversation from kind of a simple premise that infrastructure fails when it does not understand people. We talked about this, if anybody was in the abundance panel this morning. We talked about, building code is really rooted in how do you protect life safety. The understanding of a community is going to be very different. Even where it floods is going to change based on if you're looking at the FEMA maps, or are you speaking from the lived experience of somebody in a neighborhood. And that's the kind of thing that, as we think about empathy as infrastructure, that those are the kinds of things that we want to capture, just as much as the concepts of like biophilic design and elements that really draw people into a waterfront or public space. So we'll start the panel by just kind of introducing a couple projects that this team or these folks have worked on, just kind of going one by one, and then I've got a series of questions. But the central question that I want to base this conversation on is, what would it take to treat collaboration and empathy, not just concrete and codes, as essential infrastructure for the next century of waterfronts? And with that, if we could cue up the slides. Thank you. I seem to be just circling. Yes, there should be a couple like capital project slides that come up. So while we're waiting for that, I'll jump into some of the questions, and then we can take a pause and look at some of the projects. We've got on this panel global infrastructure delivery, community-led environmental justice advocacy, public sector resilience and implementation, and then collaborative learning-centered planning. Each of you engage in this work from a very different position, or even across your career have worked on this from different positions. I'm curious, when you hear the phrase empathy is infrastructure, what does that mean in practice? Not just philosophically, but in practice, in your day-to-day work. And maybe Gonzalo, do we want to start with you?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Can you guys hear me well? No. I really have to get close.
I think you got to get close to the mic.
Oh, okay. Okay. Is this better? Okay. So I came in sort of working in all these projects, I'm a landscape architect by training. I was trained as an architect as well, and I got an opportunity to work in a large-scale infrastructure company that basically facilitated the access to large-scale infrastructure projects for little people like me, people that are trained to design environments and places. And so it's been a long journey, because there were a lot of unknowns. Oh, and by the way, I am the design lead for the Wagner Park, South Battery Park City Resiliency Project. I was asked to bring some visuals, and I thought, we don't need visuals, right? You can just walk outside. It's the coolest thing. I've been preparing that little joke for quite a couple of hours, so hopefully it landed somewhere. So it was an interesting challenge for both the infrastructure engineering side and the designer side, because we were tasked with something very ultimate, the primer of the work is to keep the water levels outside of public proper and pedestrian movement and housing and recreation and all of that. And so it was a learning curve for everybody in that we had never done this sort of thing before. And we had heard about systems like this at a very different scale, at a much smaller scale in other places around the world. But in New York City, all of these projects, not just the South Battery Park City Resiliency Project, but everything that's happening in the Northwest Project, everything that's happening in the FDR Drive on the east side and the East Side Coastal Resiliency Project, these are projects they're first projects of their kind around the world at the magnitude, at the scale of public infrastructure. These are projects that are supposed to serve a public benefit with priority for public benefit. So imagine two sets of mentalities coming into play, and then trying to understand how to communicate very, very complicated ideas to the general public and to the communities in which we're sitting. And I think that's, to me, in my opinion, it's what's the majority of the work. We can speculate and design and come up with interesting strategies and ideas until the cows go home, but if we are not able to communicate and articulate visually and articulately, what these projects are about, we're not gonna get the right feedback from the community that we're serving. And so, in short, I mean, I feel like I can go on and there's been 12 years of work, associated with the work that you see around us. Without really going into too much of a tangent, I think, 70 to 75% of the process is engagement and creating the right tools and talking to the right people and getting them in the right place, so that we all understand the opportunities. Because it's not like a free-for-all with a lot of the work that we're putting forward. It's limited, but although it's limited, there's so much opportunity for placemaking and how to actually engage in the reconstruction of our urban design in the public realm with infrastructure of this scale. So I'll leave it at that. We can come back to more, but maybe Kim, if you can kind of piggyback on that.
Yeah, mine doesn't come up, so I'll build on that because. Thank you. All right, thank you, Gonzalo.
Of course.
I'm going to build on what Gonzalo said and just say that in addition to kind of teaching everybody about the resiliency work that you were working on, there was also a huge part of it was actively listening to the community and understanding what their needs are, and also understanding their lived knowledge of what it's like to live here in Battery Park City. And one thing that we really heard from them is that there's a look and feel here that is very special to them, and they didn't want this place to feel or look like Hudson River Park or something else like that. So I think empathy is listening deeply and understanding what their needs are, in addition to teaching people about what's coming and what needs to be done.
When I hear that question, I think I have to flip it in a different direction, where infrastructure should be based in empathy. And that meaning, where communities like the one which I'm representing here has seen very little empathy in terms of how infrastructure has been deployed or developed. It's been happenstance as to what you see or where you feel there's kind of really true engagement around what the project can potentially be and how can it answer some of the questions that you see on the ground. So the infrastructure we've seen has caused a lot of the problems. It hasn't solved them. And I think by living there, we know what the problems really are, right? We see the streets when they flood. We see the CSOs and the sewers backing up. We see the lack of infrastructure that really enhances quality of life. My slide is up. Okay. So, the top-down type of decisions that place peakers in our community, which is our power plants in the upper left-hand corner, to the highways and how the shoreline looks, because infrastructure wasn't really embedded in a way that led to increase in quality of life. These are existing photos. This is not like what has happened. This is what's happening right now. And what we identified was, what are some of the polluting facilities that were embedded in our community, the infrastructure that was embedded that created really noxious outcomes from heavy diesel truck intensive operations, but not just the peakers, but all these other facilities you see outlined and noted on our peninsula, which actually only have two locations. One was in the prior slide, and where the fence was broken. It's the only access to that waterway, which is the Bronx Kill, at the southernmost tip of the South Bronx. And we have about 60,000 people living there in 2.5 square miles with no access to that peninsula. What we do have access to is those industrial facilities that are causing us harm. So as a result of all that, we came together and brought together community. And to really envision, not just oppose, but propose, and create our own answers, because we are the experts, because we live there. And the answers come from the people who live there first, before you start developing and creating ideas around what it can be. What can we create together to create a better opportunity? And we keep envisioning. And this is something we don't do as a checking a box, right? Something that we have to be in front of our community and talk about. What are we seeing? What are some of the opportunities? Where are some asset mapping we can do? We do and identify locations along that peninsula that can be utilized for positive outcomes. And with that, we created our own plan. And that plan had seven different sites with a connecting green infrastructure that would give not only our community access for recreation opportunities, because we only have one park for 60,000 people in this community, but it would also, now we have playgrounds, don't get me wrong, they're asphalt, but they're not really green parks. They're not what you see out this window. So what we said, we need not only recreation in terms of community input, but we also need resiliency, because after Sandy, we saw how vulnerable we were as a community, because the infrastructure was put there that was not readily able to protect us from what was to come and what had already happened. And so the only plan that really talks about the kind of infrastructure needed to create resiliency and flood mitigation and also recreation opportunities is the plan the community came together to put forth. In that plan, we put it before the state Environmental Conservation, Department of Environmental Conservation with the Open Space Advisory Committee, and got this plan prioritized in 2016. So here we are 10 years later, but the existing photos in my slide 1 still exists. I'll leave that there for other questions, and we can talk more about it.
And Justine, maybe we'll do yours and then come back to the Battery Park City.
Yeah. Do we think we can look at some slides too?
Yes, you have the.
Yeah. Oh, I can control this. Sorry. Okay. I'm going to scroll through. So I want to talk about not projects, but programs. And I'm going to talk about 2 programs that we have been honored to work on. Let's see where we get. Oh, yes, here we are. So I'll try to do this briefly.
we're so lucky in 2024 as a firm to work on a program that many of you may be familiar with, which is the EPA Community Change Grants, Equitable Resilience Technical Assistance. It's quite a mouthful. But basically what happened was at the same time that EPA issued its notice of funding opportunity, they resourced 50 communities, 50 organizations across the US with technical assistance, consultancy services to prepare those grant applications. And we were supporting half of the US. There were 4 teams doing this, and we were covering half of it. And what was really a challenge and also an opportunity was to think about how do you create space for a community-engaged process to uplift ideas that have been incubating for a long time in communities that have been advocating for a long time, but to do it within a framework, a really short time frame, in fact, 22 weeks, to satisfy what EPA wanted from start to finish, and then to race to the finish line of actually submitting a grant application. And so we were so lucky because our very first technical assistance recipient was actually South Bronx Unite. And so these are photos from January 2024, I think, maybe the end of January, beginning of February. We were out looking at the waterfront. And I think to try to summarize this, what we realized so challenging to take an idea that had been percolating, that had been advocated for a decade, and then to fit it into the package of a grant application and to kind of reconfigure what are the priorities that match that $20 million opportunity. And I think it was only because South Bronx Unite, Mychal had been working on this for so many years, and there was such a coalition and such a clear vision from your stakeholders about what was important that we were able to try to figure out what pieces of the project could fit that opportunity. And it was a challenge because EPA, I think we could talk about that grant for hours, but in their infinite wisdom decided that they were going to issue these $20 million grants to community organizations that had not seen that kind of funding, I think, across the US ever in many cases. But at the same time, they were going to require all of the paperwork and the due diligence to make sure that it wasn't just an organization, it was an organization partnered with a municipality or another organization or a university. And so the challenge there is, how do you make the project work for the city, for the stakeholders, ultimately for the community members? And I think what we were able to put together was a piece of, what we talked about, a catalyst project to unlock the rest of the waterfront. And so the empathy there is understanding the magnitude of the challenges and the ambitions, and then being able to tease out the one piece or 2 pieces of it that we could move forward at this moment in time, and to try to unlock something else by doing this project. I'll try to talk really briefly about another initiative that I think is taking a different approach to this. And I have been working since 2023 supporting the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice. I have some colleagues here in the room who could talk more about it. This is taking those principles of listening and going to community members in 21 neighborhoods across New York City from the earliest stages, before there's any project identified. And I think the empathetic move is to say that the needs of climate resilience and needs of our waterfront are also community needs, and listening to what our community needs generally for these neighborhoods, and to understand that beginning from seeing neighborhoods through community members' eyes, walking neighborhoods together, bringing stakeholders together from agencies, from other organizations, with a community partner who is a trusted neighborhood leader, with other neighborhood support team members who have been longtime community stakeholders, that we are not starting from zero, and that the new ideas, quote, new ideas of climate resilience are actually uplifting and creating space for community priorities that have been long held, and finding the places that there's an intersection of resilience priorities and community needs. And so CSC has been working with its community partners all over the city for the last few years and trying to find ways both to increase literacy around what are the programs that the city is running, what types of projects is the city good at implementing, what types of projects is the city not good at implementing, and how can we improve? And then creating opportunities that neighborhood leaders can become stewards and advocates and teachers, especially for their other, for the larger community.
All right, and if you could advance the slide.
Oh, this last slide.
So I'll also talk briefly about some Waterfront Alliance's work in this space. So we recently released the Flushing Meadows Corona Park Resilience Study, which proposes daylighting Flushing Creek through Flushing Meadows Corona Park. And this project, I think we wanted to share it because this is emblematic of what kind of this type of design should look like and what this process should look like. So Waterfront Alliance received a congressional appropriation from Congresswoman Meng, who in Flushing, to do flood resilience work at the park, which is one of the most frequently flooded parks in New York City, flagship park of Queens, but woefully kind of under-maintained and undervalued because Parks just doesn't have the budget to maintain it, and they don't have the same kind of like conservancy power that Brooklyn Bridge Park or Central Park or some of the other flagship parks of the city have. And you know, we walked into this project going, we are starting with a blank slate, that we aren't coming in with any kind of preconceived notion of what do we want to design. We want to listen to community members tell us where it's flooding, where it matters to them that it's flooding, and what they would like to see done. And because of some of the partners that really engaged in that, like Guardians of Flushing Bay, there was this really resounding push for, well, we've got to daylight the creek. And you know, the more we talk to folks over and over, this idea, which had been talked about in different capacities for, you know, as far back as 10 or 20 years ago, kept coming up. Right now, the creek that's shown there is actually largely in 2 underground pipes. That it only comes up in that kind of circular area, the Fountain of the Planets, and then goes back into pipes that causes all kinds of flooding issues because there's just not the space for the water to go. But we got to tap into this community enthusiasm for this idea that, you know, even like the Parks Department was kind of skeptical of, as our partner on the project, was kind of skeptical of at the beginning and thinking about, this is really large, this is a big capacity project, this is this fundamental change to the park. But the feedback that we got from the users of the park, the residents of Flushing and Corona, was so significant that, you know, parks started to get excited about this idea. We got to actually really push that forward. And the goal of this project was to get parks to like 10% design so that they could put this into grant applications and actually get the funding for it. And we were able to take this concept that had been talked about for so long, but for the first time put engineering and landscape architecture expertise to it, which we were really excited to bring that resource to the community. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Gonzalo, and we can just click through for a really long time. Whichever one you tell me to stop.
Oh, yeah, it's fine. I didn't bring it.
Go ahead and go back. These are my
Oh,
slides.
those are yours? Okay.
Yeah. Sorry.
Whoever would like to go
It's
first,
okay.
you're welcome to.
Yeah. You said you don't have slides, right? So we'll share.
Yeah.
So Gonzalo and I will share our slides because we worked on this project together.
Technically, I drew that.
Yeah. So I just wanted to start with Battery Park City, with it being the connected and resilient waterfront. The the piece of the South Battery Park City is the part that Gonzalo was mentioning earlier, which you can see in the lower left-hand side, and which you can see out the window if you go outside. And then the Northwest project is another 1.5 miles of waterfront resiliency project that is currently starting construction, is starting phase 2 of a progressive design build with Turner SPC as a joint venture with Big and Scape. And it's one of the first kind of progressive design build infrastructure projects here in the city. And I should also mention that the South Battery Park City project is a WEDG verified project as well.
Thank you for that plug.
Yes, I'm going to plug that. And during the design process, there was really a lot of principles and purposes and goals that the team had. The team of engineers put this, put it together. Passive flood protection was one of the primary goals for the project. Urban heat island mitigation. So the Northwest project is incorporating high SRI paving materials and expanding the landscaping. Expanded green infrastructure and drainage. So green space was increased by almost 30%, and integrated native plantings and sustainable stormwater management. And then there was a community-focused public space. So the project was preserving trees, restoring waterfront views to the Hudson and the Statue of Liberty, and creating shading. And I think that one thing that really set the table for this is that the project started, and if you could zoom in on this, the timeline is so long because it really started in 2019, and the table was set quite a long time ago by a group of people at Battery Park City who were meeting with the community, holding community meetings long before the progressive design team even showed up. And so that was really AECOM and One Architecture and ASC were involved in that. And I think you can see there's like a huge part of the timeline that happened before the design team showed up. And I just want to say there were this many meetings, maybe more, with stakeholder engagement. And I've just put in the boundaries that this is the Community Board 1 boundary, but because Battery Park City is a state entity, they were not required to actually go to Community Board 1, but they did. So they constantly went back, met with the community, and continually got feedback. So this slide really represents a lot of the outreach meetings that happened, and I just wanted to talk about a couple of the really special things that happened, which were these site walks. And it was something that I think the community, they were able to really engage in the project, and you could get great feedback from those site walks. They took all day, people walking 2 miles with the whole group. And then a lot of the tabling events were Ask an Expert, so tabling set up with engineers, answering questions that we had heard previously. So, what about the trees? What about some engineering concepts? So there were different tables for that. So I think really one of the reasons that the Battery Park City projects were so successful is that they had so much input from the community. I don't know if you want to add.
Yeah, it's over years of constant conversation and tool generation and basically teaching the community about the implications of scaled infrastructure of this kind. That's really how people began to kind of get behind some of the design ideas. And this whole notion of what does a park look like when a flood wall kind of intersects it? It's exactly where the conversation started, and people were at the beginning very, very concerned because of the implications, the height of these interventions and such. And so we were able to very, very slowly over time, with the help of many people, these projects too Kimberlae, they take an army. We're just like a mere drop in the bucket. As I look at people across the room, I see Bonnie there, instrumental to a lot of the early process of engagement. It's kind of hard to explain what is deployable and what is passive to begin with as a concept not to you guys, because you're very familiar with the topic, but for everyone outside of this room, it's kind of a tricky thing to convey. And so it didn't take 1 or 2 times or 3 times. It didn't take a video or 2 or a drawing or a model. It took all of those things and many more levels of interaction with the community to like I've mentioned a number of times, to get people behind the opportunities, because there's just so much opportunity. People, we just have to kind of think about things a little differently, accept the challenge and kind of walk it forward. And so, I mean, this process that Kim described for the Northwest, it's replicated exactly for the South, which was a project that we completed at AECOM with a bunch of other design consultants and architects and engineers.
So I want to, before we'll leave space for maybe 1 or 2 questions from the audience at the end, because we're flying through this panel slot. But I want to ask, empathy is often framed as consensus building, but in real projects, it can really surface deep conflicts. So can each of you kind of describe a moment when kind of listening more closely made a project actually harder and not easier, and then how do you think of those trade-offs?
Yeah, I think I can start.
Yeah.
I always think about this because we went through. It was a challenge at the beginning to kind of get people behind some of the things that needed to happen. People, for example, in Wagner Park were accustomed to. They had a history. There's a lot of. This is a very sort of embedded community. Children have been born here. They grew up here. They became adolescents. They went to school around the area, and so there was a lot of that sort of sentiment around change and how to preserve some of those very things that are non-negotiable. Memories that you live in a park. Ultimately, like parks are meant to create memories. That's really what parks are there for. And so how do you sort of begin a conversation about something so intimate? And I think that through a few design cues, we were able to start a conversation about the basis of the design that was formerly there. How people arrived to the park, where people were coming from, how people used the park, what was the purpose of the pavilion. The pavilion in into itself served as an entry gateway to the park. How do you arrive to that pavilion? Through the north and south, alley of trees. Those were design principles that we were able to take and implement into the new design of the park. And so in talking to people about those experiences and how, if you squint your eye, the sentiment of the park is still there, was something that over time we learned how to calibrate, and people began to kind of think about, our design team not coming in, out of nowhere and changing everything for the sake of changing stuff, but more about keeping the integrity of the experience of the park and replicating it in a slightly elevated fashion. Like literally, like the big difference between what was there and what's there today is the fact that the park had to be raised because of issues of flood protection and mitigation. But in terms of the programming and how people entered and exited the park and the purpose of the great big lawn, I mean, those were things that we were able to achieve, and people got kind of behind the sentiment of the fact that, this notion of empathy, right? Like you're working with what people are accustomed to experience. Another huge thing that was very important for the community was this notion of universal access, and it's something that we also achieved, I think, really well. Like the park is designed as an environment for anybody and everybody to experience equally. There's none of this sort of like, you go to the back for a ramp entry sequence, or you take those stairs if you're with this certain condition, the whole thing is supposed to flow very seamlessly, and it welcomes everybody. And so that's another notion of empathy that we were able to craft with substantial communication with the community. So I can only speak with it from the perspective of a designer and how to engage with people's emotional investment in these environments and how to translate that into a design that they feel comfortable with.
And if I could, I'd like to jump to Mychal
Yeah.
next. One of the things to kind of expand on this question of, the kind of the conflicts that can exist. One of the things that South Bronx Unite has talked about for a long time is that the waterfront is not a blank slate, that this is a site of extraction, displacement, cumulative harm. So I'm curious, in places like Mott Haven and Port Morris, where communities carry really long memories that institutions don't, how does that play into this, and what happens when a project moves forward without accounting for that?
Yeah, Joseph, that's a good question. I think it still goes back to empathy, where we don't see empathy in infrastructure and where it's placed and how it's designed. I'm looking at what has been developed and what's developed around the city, and it's not equitable. It's not the same. Doesn't exist everywhere. When we put, so the way we respond to not being really engaged is often it's the same old, right? We're getting the same old treatment of we're building this for whom, but not really for us. And that cycle has to change, and I think in the society we live in, it can't exist that way. I mean, we're now planting seeds with the new urban planners of the future, and how we do that in an equitable and empathetic way. And where are we implementing infrastructure development projects that will enhance quality of life that's not just in the same locations all the time. So when our folks see people come in to want to build a power plant or build more truck infrastructure on our peninsula, or last mile warehouse or a data center, those things we're like, hell no, because we're tired of seeing the same old. It's a cycle of harm repeating itself. So we're all about resisting those type of measures of non-empathetic design and infrastructure implementations, and looking for a different way and a different path that we should be taking as a society, and not doing the same thing and investing in the same locations and creating little islands in places where we don't have access to the water that surrounds us. So, I mean, that's what I have to speak to, that level of injustice or inequity is something should be different and has to be different.
All right, so we've got about 5 minutes left. I'd love, if the panel's okay with it, to take a couple questions from the audience. So any questions out there? Yeah, I see a hand, but can't see who's raising it.
Yeah.
We'll repeat the question back.
I don't know if the cord goes that far. Oh, that way.
Mine is good.
All right, hello. Thank you for the conversation. I loved hearing about how extensive your stakeholder engagement process was. I'm just curious to know what strategies you used to figure out which parts of the community to target when you were having your meetings to ensure that you had really good turnout. Were there any lessons that you learned or obstacles that you had to overcome in the beginning when you were first figuring out how to reach the community to make sure that you were actually collecting input instead of just holding meetings?
Is there any particular project you are most interested in, or all of them?
All of them, fine. Wherever there was stakeholder engagement.
Yeah, I mean, in Battery Park City, there was a lot of postering and sending out. Every person in the zip code received things in their mailbox, telling them about meetings, things like that. So there was an extensive outreach in that way, like really trying to reach everybody. Although people still claimed that they didn't know about things, stuff like that. It's always very hard to make sure everybody hears.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I mean, we reach out to community boards. We go to where people are recreating, either in community gardens, because we don't have a lot of parks. We also make sure we're there in front of where people are going, taking their kids to school, make sure that we have already a network established of how to do outreach. We do already local action committee meetings monthly. So we are the community, so we're already interfacing, but we have a lot more work to do because there's always a lot to organize and make sure information is out and available so folks can actually be a part of what's happening.
So in Climate Strong Communities, we used the model of the neighborhood support team, which was first a community partner, which was an organization with deep roots in that particular community. And then working with that organization, they nominated 5 to 8 other members of the neighborhood support team. So we started the process meeting with that collective, talking about what they saw as neighborhood priorities. And then we did site walks where we brought together agency stakeholders and team stakeholders, and the walks were led by community members. After that, we did tabling events, which I think, like Mychal mentioned, going to places where people are, not necessarily creating one-of-a-kind events. So farmers markets, book events, church events, you name it, libraries. And then we held public workshops, and there we really asked community stakeholders to get out the word. And so networks like South Bronx Unites, monthly meeting, that's an incredible network to tap into of people who are already engaged in advocacy and in planning. And finally, we brought the community stakeholders together across the city through a climate summit. We've done this year will be the 3rd year. And so it's really a broad model, but led through community leaders reaching out to their networks instead of us as consultants or the city, going through broadcast channels.
It's always changing too. Like it's kind of evolving. Like 12 years ago, we were doing things slightly different. Like we're kind of like by the book. We're put postings and we'll send newsletters and stuff like that. These days, we're like piggybacking on anything in any sort of group that has outreach to people. Like particularly, I see a lot of movement in the Bronx, for example, with Amaury's team. Like he's like very good at accessing people through TikTok and like social media, and I mean like really that's where the younger generation is plugged at the moment, and so it's always changing, and it's kind of fun, really.
All right, and with that, we are at time. So I want to thank everybody for joining us. Thank you to our panelists.